So Season 7 of Diablo 4 has been out for a few weeks now, and I've really been enjoying it, and I think this is going to be seen as one of the best seasons so far. But one of the new pieces of content with this season, I think it could be used as a massive upgrade to some of the more permanent systems. And this system being the new Roothold mini dungeons that have some roguelike elements in them. And I think if they take some of the systems from these Rootholds and apply them to specifically Nightmare Dungeons, they could massively improve the Nightmare Dungeon system, which is something that I think does need some improving. And these Rootholds are a set of new mini dungeons that require a key just like Nightmare Dungeons, but they play in a completely different way. First off, right when you enter into a Roothold, you have a choice of 4 different buffs that also have a downside. So they're pretty similar to the boons you can get in the Infernal Horde mode as well. And in the Rootholds, there's only 3 different buffs you can get. Either a buff to give you major rewards, a buff to give minor rewards, or a buff to give more exposed roots. So all of the buffs in the Rootholds are just buffing up the amount of loot you're going to be getting and also kind of the different types of loot you're going to be getting. And you can choose 2 out of these 4 buffs, which is also a bit of a departure from the Infernal Hordes where you only choose 1 buff every round. But after you choose that, it drops the gate and you can enter, and your objective is just to find all of the exposed roots. Click on them, they will spew out a bunch of loot that will also be augmented depending on what buffs you chose, and to kill all of the enemies as you're going through. Once you've found all the exposed roots, you'll enter the next section of the dungeon where you choose 2 out of 3 buffs, and they're the exact same buffs you could get at the start of the dungeon, just again randomized. And then the next section, you do the exact same thing. You go click on all the exposed roots, get massive amounts of loot, and then there's a boss at the end after you've gotten all the roots in the second section. And there's 2 main elements that I think could massively improve the Nightmare Dungeoning system. First off, the buffs and debuffs. Just getting that small amount of changes that can buff up your loot, but also make that dungeon significantly more difficult, because some of these buffs can legitimately make the dungeon much more difficult, especially something like you get stunned for 1.5 seconds when you use a potion. That has legitimately gotten me killed in some of these runs, because I would forget I would have it, use it, stun myself and die to something, or I would take a bunch of damage, use it, and then I would be stunned and they would finish me off in that stun. So some of these debuffs can be incredibly strong, but you get to choose a bit more of the difficulty of that dungeon. Do you want to take the buff that adds the most rewards but also has the biggest downside to make the dungeon much more difficult? Or are you a bit weaker, you want to take one of the lesser buffs but also have a lesser increase to the difficulty? And then the second part being the exposed roots. Now, I don't think they should take every Nightmare Dungeon and just have the objective be to go click on a bunch of these roots that spew out loot. I think this season actually has too much gear drops in general, and these Rootholds give a lot of loot, but I do think something like this could actually be a good addition to Nightmare Dungeons, especially how Nightmare Dungeons play now. So generally just adding some amount of these random loot piles you can find that you click on, spawns a bunch of enemies, but also gives you just a ridiculous amount of loot. And you could have them be quite a bit more rare, but just adding something in like these roots to give a little bit more variation to the dungeons goes a long way in removing a lot of the tedium you can sometimes get when you're just running Nightmare Dungeons back to back to back. And I do think they could also massively expand upon these systems for Nightmare Dungeon versions. Now, if you haven't played Diablo 4 or Nightmare Dungeons for a handful of seasons, in one of the previous seasons, Nightmare Dungeons were pretty heavily changed compared to the start of the game. So if you started playing Diablo 4 on launch, Nightmare Dungeons were how you upgraded your glyphs. That means that pretty much every Nightmare Dungeon run, you would want to complete it as quickly as possible to get your glyph upgrade. That is how every dungeon was tiered into tier lists and how everybody played them. Run to the end as quickly as possible. But in one of the previous seasons, Nightmare Dungeons were swapped with the pit. So you used to run the pit for the masterworking upgrade materials. So you would run the pit, which is built around doing it as fast as possible, and then you would get your upgrading materials, which are just obdicite now. So the developers decided to swap these systems, which I think made both of these pieces of content significantly better than they used to be, because now the pit runs, which already want you to go as quickly as possible, are now what give you your glyph upgrades. So that works perfectly with how we were playing Nightmare Dungeons before, getting to the end as quickly as possible to to upgrade your glyphs. And then all of the masterworking materials were added to the Nightmare Dungeons. So now you don't actually need to run to the end of the Nightmare Dungeon as quickly as possible, because anything you do in the Nightmare Dungeon will give you your masterworking materials. Killing any enemy, opening chests, doing the events, doing anything in there will give you that masterworking material. So now you could go clear out the whole dungeon, you could explore the whole dungeon, do all the side objectives, and all of it is actually worth to do. So that was a pretty big change, but I think it was a massive upgrade for the game in general. But on top of that, specifically for Nightmare Dungeons, they could now also add these different buffs you could choose when starting a Nightmare Dungeon that can massively improve the experience as well. Even if they just added these 4 buffs and debuffs and you can choose 2 of them at the start of a Nightmare Dungeon, that would probably make Nightmare Dungeons at least a little bit better, even just directly copying it from Rootholds. You could choose the legendary buffs that give a pretty big downside but give you, say, a lot more Opticite. You could choose the rare buffs which give a lesser downside but give you minor rewards, so a lesser increase to the masterworking materials. And then the common choice just gives you the least downside but also gives you the least upside. Even if they just carbon copied that into Nightmare Dungeons, it would make them better, because you get to choose, do you want the dungeon to be quite a bit harder but give more rewards, or much less harder but give a lesser increase to rewards? And I think they could expand upon this and it would make Nightmare Dungeons even better. I think one of the easiest ways to do it would just be allow you to choose a lot more of these buffs and debuffs and basically allow you to keep stacking them up, which would make the dungeon substantially more difficult. Like if you start stacking up too many of these buffs, you could get like 3-second stuns using a potion. You could have constant fireballs raining down on you that do a bunch of damage to you. You could get the debuff that you just randomly take a bunch of damage over time. There could be the debuff that your potion goes on a cooldown after you use it. There could be the debuff that a bunch of meteors drop on you anytime you use your dash, and you could just stack these up more and more with a lot of other options if you want to have a super juiced dungeon, but it would obviously be substantially more difficult. And I think if they were going to do this and then expand upon these Roothold buffs, I think they would probably want to be some type of re-rolling system to where you could re-roll the buffs at least a few times, maybe allow you to use sigil powder to re-roll these buffs at the start of the Nightmare Dungeon and allow you to just keep choosing pretty much as many as you want, or at least as many as you want up to a certain point. So you can really juice up these Nightmare Dungeons, make them much harder, but give a lot more buffs. And then all the way down to maybe only choosing 1 buff or maybe choosing no buffs if you don't want the dungeon to be more difficult whatsoever. And when you look at this from a top-down view, the main thing you're doing is just allowing the players to choose the difficulty and more choose the rewards they're getting from that experience. Because one of, I think, the biggest issues that the Diablo 4 team is gonna have to deal with coming up in these next few seasons and expansion is figuring out how to keep the game more accessible, but also allow the game to be much more difficult for the players who want it to be much more difficult. Because I do think the game being a bit easy in a lot of different systems is one of the bigger issues right now, and this is a pretty simple fix to allow for that. Allow the players to make the dungeon a lot more difficult for just more loot. I also think this season is dropping just way too much loot in the season-specific activities, but that's something they could just tune down and not give so much loot in the next season. But I very much hope they don't just delete all, but I very much hope they use these systems from these new Roothold dungeons and add them into Nightmare Dungeons, because I think these new buffs are just really suited to work very well with Nightmare Dungeons. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.